Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku.
Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. On Science Fantastic, we profile the amazing, jaw-dropping scientific discoveries which are revolutionizing our world and touching our lives. And in this hour, we're going to talk about one of the most indispensable devices that we use literally every day without even thinking about it, and that's the GPS system. A system that allows you to calculate where you are on the Earth anywhere from anywhere by logging on to satellites in outer space. Our special guest today is Greg Milner. He's the author of a new book about the GPS system called Pinpoint, How GPS is Changing Technology, Culture, and Our Minds. He's the author of a previous book called Perfecting Sound Forever, and he's written for Wired, New York Magazine, Slate, Village Voice, Salon Spin, and Rolling Stone Magazine. So we'll be talking about the origin, the purpose, how it works, and what about this Pokemon craze that's gripped the planet as everyone seems to want to locate objects by running into the streets. So we'll talk about the darker side of the technology. What happens when China, Russia, the Europeans, they all want their own GPS systems? Well, once again, with us today is Greg Milner. He'll be coming on in just a few moments, talking about the GPS system. First of all, we have numerous satellites orbiting outer space. At any given time, your cell phone receives signals from up to 4 satellites in outer space. You just need 4 satellites, and then you use something called the Doppler shift. You see, when a satellite comes toward you, the frequencies are compressed as they come toward you, and as a consequence, the frequency is higher pitched. When a satellite moves away from you, it's lower pitched because the radio waves are stretched as they move away from you. If this was sound waves, it would sound like this. Now, you've heard that all your life. All your life you heard that, but maybe you didn't know what that was. That's called the Doppler shift. So when a car moves toward you, pitch is compressed and higher. When a car whizzes past you and sound is lowered, that's because sound is stretched as the car moves away from you. The same thing happens with radio. When a radio-emitting satellite moves toward you, waves are compressed. In fact, we can measure precisely the amount of compression, and by logging on to 4 satellites, you can triangulate where you are on the surface of the Earth. And bingo, that's how you do it. Now, you may say to yourself, well, what about Einstein? I mean, isn't Einstein's theory showing that all that stuff has to be warped? And the answer is yes. Therefore, even the GPS system has to be modified to take into account Einstein's theory of special and general relativity. This is incredible if you think about it. The GPS system is so accurate, and we depend upon it to fight wars and locate missing children. It's so accurate that Pentagon generals have to use Einstein's theory of general relativity in order to calculate corrections to the GPS system, or else it don't work. That's how powerful the GPS system is, that you even have to go down to relativistic corrections. You actually have to use Einstein's theory to locate where you are on this map.
You're listening to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. You're listening to Science Fantastic.
Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. In this hour, we're going to talk about a technology that is so indispensable, we don't even think about it. But there it is in outer space, a high-tech device that is indispensable for the economy and your life. We're talking about the GPS systems, one of the great successes of modern technology. And with us today to talk about that is Greg Milner. He's the author of a new book called Pinpoint, How GPS is Changing Technology, Culture, and Our Minds. He's the author of a previous book, Perfecting Sound Forever, which was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, and his work has appeared in Wired, New York Magazine, Slate, Village Voice, Salon Spin, and Rolling Stone. So, Greg, glad you could be on Science Fantastic.
Oh, thank you for having me on.
Well, first question for you is, how did you first get interested in technology and writing, and eventually writing about the GPS program?
Well, at first it began with, I used to be a journalist covering mostly music, and I realized that what seemed to be most interesting about music was how it was the science behind it, how it was recorded, and the choices that were made when recording it. A long time ago, I was a graduate student in anthropology at NYU, and I wrote a master's thesis on the transition from analog to digital recording technologies in the music industry. After I transitioned away from that, it was a few years ago, and I started to realize that GPS was kind of ubiquitous. I mean, it was starting to migrate onto our phones, and it seemed like everybody used it in some way, shape, or form, but nobody, myself included, that I talked to seemed to know what GPS was. I wasn't sure if it was a specific technology or just a general description of types of technologies or who was behind it. So I set out to go looking for basically those two answers, like what was GPS and who was behind it, who was controlling it. And the more I learned, it was kind of like peeling an onion. Just when I thought I'd sort of discovered the limit of what GPS was being used for, I'd find something else.
Well, GPS, of course, is a multi-billion-dollar system of satellites in outer space. And then the question is, well, who paid for it? And was GPS invented just so that mothers can find their wayward children, or so that campers wouldn't get lost in the forest? I mean, who actually bankrolled GPS?
Well, GPS is wholly owned and operated by the United States federal government, specifically the Department of Defense. The day-to-day operations are run by the United States Air Force out of a Schriever Air Force Base outside of Colorado Springs, Colorado. It was originally designed basically as a military tool. I mean, there were some precursors to GPS done by the Navy, but the real GPS program, GPS as we know it today, began as an Air Force program in the early 70s. And there was always supposed to be a civilian component to it. That was always a precondition for its funding. But it was really designed as a way to, the way that Brad Parkinson, the Air Force colonel who really launched the program, put it, he wanted to find a way to drop 5 bombs in the same hole. He had some experience in Vietnam during the air campaign, and he was really dismayed by how indiscriminate bombing was there. And so in his mind, you can debate whether this is, true or not, but he saw that GPS as being a way to wage war more humanely because bombs could be dropped where they really should be dropped, not wherever.
Now, we all have images of World War II that we learned in school and we see on old reruns on television, specifically the bombing of Dresden and the firebombing of Tokyo, which caused enormous, absolutely catastrophic human casualties. Was it because people were simply evil and malevolent and wanted to incinerate people, or is it because our bombs simply were not accurate?
Well, I think it's somewhere in between the two. I mean, I think what happened in World War II was that certain choices were made. I know that there was a little bit of an emphasis on precision bombing in the earlier air campaigns, and it just was decided that that was not worth the risk because, pilots put themselves more at risk when they did things like that. So, like you said, there were these things that were caused by just, really just indiscriminate bombing. The way Brad Parkinson put it to me is that he was really aware of what happened in Vietnam. And, in fact, what he saw happen, what happened in World War II. And what he saw happening in Vietnam was a repeat of that. And he used to say, like, bombing, in World War II, it was often used more as an instrument of terror than it was as a way to actually wage war. And so in his mind, he wanted to correct the mistakes that the Air Force was making by still adhering to these kind of World War II approaches to air campaigns.
And also, wasn't the United States Air Force interested in precision-guided ICBM missiles? I mean, if you're going to launch a nuclear war, you want to make sure that your H-bomb lands in Red Square rather than, 30 miles outside Moscow, right? So didn't they want pinpoint accuracy for our ICBMs, and therefore they needed some kind of satellite-guided MX missile?
Well, there's a couple ways to answer that question. I mean, one of the weirdest things about the history of GPS is that at first the Air Force, by and large, didn't really want it at all. Parkinson and his team were really operating as kind of almost rogue elements within the Air Force, not literally because it was being funded, but the vast majority of people in the Air Force did not see the point of GPS at all, as hard as that is for us to understand. They just didn't see why they needed another navigation system, although what the people who were designing GPS would tell them often is, like, look, don't think of it as a navigation system, think of it as a guidance system. So, as the years went on and the military started to really see the military applications of GPS, they started applying it to a lot of different things. And like you say, ICBMs, I mean, not only is it important that the missile, hit not 30 miles off of where it's supposed to be, apparently one of the most interesting things I discovered in doing this book is that they wanted the missiles they had to explode right over the silos. They couldn't, they couldn't be more than a certain height above it. You would think that with that kind of destruction it wouldn't matter, but it really did. So GPS was a way, once they started figuring out all these applications for it, was a way to make sure that things were really, pinpointed with incredible accuracy, not just somewhat accurate.
Now, also within the Pentagon, there's a celebrated unit called DARPA, and DARPA is credited with, first of all, forming NASA. NASA was one of the offshoots of DARPA. Also, the Internet. The Internet used to be called DARPANet.
Yeah.
And artificial intelligence has been pioneered by DARPA. I see that in your book you didn't mention DARPA. Is that because DARPA missed the boat on this? Or was DARPA also involved in the creation of GPS as well as the Internet and NASA and so on and so forth?
Today, DARPA is involved in studying GPS and I think recommending some improvements. But at the time, they weren't really involved with this. I mean, what's interesting about GPS is that it kind of develops alongside, parallel to the Internet, but it wasn't really a DARPA thing. DARPA did get involved actually in the 80s in wanting to design a very small GPS receiver. They nicknamed it the Virginia Slims Project because they wanted it to be no bigger than a cigarette box. And they wanted something with military precision. But in terms of designing the actual technology, DARPA didn't really play a role in this.
Okay. Now let's talk about the science of the satellite system itself. First of all, how many satellites are there in outer space? And at any given time, how many satellites does your cell phone lock onto?
Well, the entire constellation is about 30 or 31 satellites, depending on how many spares are around. At any given moment, there's 24 active satellites arrayed in orbits such that from pretty much just about any spot on Earth, you should get a line of sight to at least 4 satellites. And the reason is because your phone, or really any GPS receiver, and it should be emphasized that every GPS receiver, whether it's on an ICBM or your phone, works exactly the same way. They always need at least 4 simultaneous lines of sight to a satellite in order to make a position fix. So you need 4 to really get the actual accuracy that GPS is capable of.
Okay. Now, some people are a little bit gun-shy about cell phones because they think maybe it causes cancer or something. But isn't it true that the cell phone in the GPS is basically a receiver? It doesn't send anything to the satellite at all. It's basically a receiver.
Absolutely, and this is one of the most important things about GPS. It's what's known as a passive navigation system, meaning that you only have to receive signals, you don't have to actually send them. And that's good for a number of reasons. First of all, it means that GPS itself cannot locate you, so people who have privacy concerns, it's things that exist alongside GPS, but not GPS itself. But GPS also, the fact that it's passive is important because the number of GPS users could double tomorrow, and it wouldn't affect the system at all, any more than it would affect radio if the number of radios doubled tomorrow, because these satellites do not have to receive anything. They only have to send out these signals.
And I should point out, of course, how useful GPS is. Think of the old days when you're driving down a country road and it's totally dark outside. You can't see any road signs. But today with GPS, you can perfectly navigate on country roads. Isn't it amazing the versatility of this system?
Absolutely, although, of course, it cuts both ways, because back in the old days on that country road, you probably got there, most likely you had a paper map in your glove compartment so you could try to figure out where you were. And today, using GPS, the GPS itself might have led you to that country road only for you to discover that it really isn't a place where your car should be, or maybe the geographical data in the map program is even a little bit wrong, and you find yourself lost. I mean, that's such a common occurrence that in Death Valley, California, the park rangers coined a term called death by GPS. And that refers to what happens when people at Death Valley trust their GPS too much rather than trust, say, paper maps or road signs. They can really, lead people astray. And it doesn't mean that you literally have to die from these accidents. Most death by GPS incidents don't even lead to serious injury. They're more kind of just embarrassing, if anything. But that's one of the sort of the hidden things about GPS. One of the sort of unintended consequences is that it's supposedly a technology that makes it impossible to get lost, but in a way it's just made us come up with new ways to get lost.
Now, of course, there was that fatal accident involving a Tesla recently that shocked the world. However, if you think about the dynamics of that fatal accident, I imagine it wasn't the GPS's fault. It was the fault of the system unable to recognize a truck turning in front of you, but the GPS correctly identified its location. Right. But the radar system, I think, malfunctioned and was unable to tell the driver that there was a truck coming at him. But what are your thoughts?
A very, very important point about GPS. The way, if you talk to people involved with GPS at Schriever Air Force Base, where the master control station is, they'll point out that GPS it can be divided into three segments. There's the space segment, and that's the satellite constellation. There's the control segment, and that's the network of GPS monitoring stations that are spread around the world that monitor the satellites as they come over the horizon and send the data back to Schriever. And then there's the user segment, and that's all of us, all of our GPS receivers. And what they'll tell you at Schriever is, look, we're responsible for number one and number two, for the space segment and the user segment. After that signal leaves the satellite, it's out of our hands, and what you decide to do with it is up to you. And I think the point that they're making is that GPS itself is just a neutral signal that you can do a lot of things with. And really, it's not foolproof, obviously, but it's a very, very well-designed system. So when you hear people talking about GPS accidents or GPS leading them astray, for the most part, what they're talking about is an accident that doesn't really involve GPS itself. I mean, like you say, GPS probably located the Tesla where it was supposed to be. It's just something more like the radar didn't recognize that was a truck coming in front of it.
This is Science Fantastic. Here is Professor Michio Kaku.
Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. Once again on Science Fantastic, we're profiling some of the most cutting edge of technologies. And here's one that we take for granted because literally it's everywhere, and we depend upon it all the time, and that is a GPS system. And with us today is Greg Milner, author of a new book, Pinpoint, How GPS is Changing Technology, Culture, and Our Minds. Well, Greg, we last left off, we were talking about GPS in the car. And let me ask you a question that's kind of like bothered me sometimes. And that is, we all know that there's road construction, and roads are sometimes closed off and with repairs. And so what about the GPS system? Are all GPS systems updated to take into account the fact that roads are under repair almost all the time?
Well, again, we're not really talking about GPS affecting things like that. I mean, again, GPS is basically giving you a latitude and longitude and altitude, if necessary, reading. It's the things that it's what's called GIS, which, unlike GPS, is not a specific technology, but it's a combination of technologies like cartography and computer science and database management. And it's what creates the sort of deep maps that we depend on today, particularly Google Maps, especially. Now, the companies that run those map programs, they're the ones who are really responsible for keeping geographic data up to date. And because they need to make sure that the latitude, longitude, and altitude signals calculations you get correspond to actual roads. And so those companies are constantly trying to monitor, things like road changes and road construction. And it's, as anyone could probably tell you, who's experienced a GPS-related error, they don't always stay completely up to date, but they're trying. I mean, they're always trying to be on top of things.
So, in other words, it's not the GPS system itself that may be a little bit out of date with regards to detours and stuff like that. It's the company that then interprets all this data and then puts it into your car system. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the geographic data that GPS uses, in other words, the model of the Earth that is used to turn those turn those calculations into geographic coordinates, that data is handled by the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, a intelligence wing of the Pentagon. So they're responsible for that, but what we're talking about here is making sure that data conforms to the correct road you're on. And yeah, in that sense, that's completely not something that anyone involved in the GPS program per se works on or is responsible for.
Okay, so the next time you wind up on a road that's closed, you can blame not the Pentagon that monitors the system, that maintains the system, but the commercial entity on the Earth that interprets this data for your car.
Yep. In fact, it just happened to me the other day, so I know how frustrating that can be.
Okay. Let's move on. Let's talk about other countries and hackers. First of all, is it possible that someone could one day hack into the system and create worldwide havoc as a consequence?
It's a complicated answer. Yes, the basic answer is yes, but what people should realize is that the GPS system itself as a whole is pretty robust. I mean, in order to really disrupt it, people would have to have some sort of method of disrupting the satellites, which are 20,000 kilometers away, or they'd have to have a way to infiltrate the GPS master control station in Colorado, where, and I know this from experience, it's very, very heavily guarded to the extent that there's posters all over the place authorizing the use of deadly force if necessary, and doors that you have to walk through quickly or else an alarm will sound if they're open too long. So GPS as a whole is very, very, very unlikely to go down. However, what is vulnerable is GPS on a local basis. GPS is very easily jammed. In fact, at certain places like on the New Jersey Turnpike near the Newark Airport, there was so much use of GPS jammers, and these are simple devices that can be obtained off the Internet. They were used by drivers to try to foil the GPS tracking systems that their bosses use to make sure they know where they are. That it was actually affecting the GPS-based landing system at Newark Airport. So they're worried about jamming, but an even more insidious thing that can happen is called spoofing, and that's when somebody introduces a bogus signal that looks, for all intents and purposes, like the GPS signal and fools GPS receivers in the vicinity into thinking that they're picking up the real thing. And what's really dangerous about that is that there are many, many systems that use GPS that are spread over very wide geographic areas that are all connected. For example, the electrical grid. So if one node of the electrical grid gets a spoofed GPS signal and thinks that power is being routed in a weird way, it could cause cascading blackouts, for example.
Okay, wow.
You're listening to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. Listening to Science Fantastic.
Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. Once again, our special guest today is Greg Milner. We're talking about the GPS system, and his latest book is called Pinpoint, How GPS is Changing Technology, Culture, and Our Minds. Well, once again, with us today is Greg Milner, author of an exciting new book called Pinpoint, How GPS is Changing Technology, Culture, and Our Minds. Greg, here's a question that's often puzzled me. Let's say you're going through a tunnel. And, well, of course, radio signals, it's a hard slog for them to go into a tunnel like that. So are there blackouts? And what happens if you're in a driverless car and all of a sudden you lose your GPS signal?
Well, yeah, that's a very good question, and yes, there can be GPS disruptions. Especially in urban areas where there's lots of skyscrapers, because they can it can disrupt the GPS signal and make it hard for it to reach them. That's why most transportation things that use GPS also have redundant systems that are based on forms of dead reckoning, meaning navigation that figures out where you are by knowing where you were at a previous point in time. So, for things that really require precision, there needs to be something besides GPS, and I think driverless cars are going to be no exception. GPS alone won't cut it. There are going to need to be things that are a backup for it.
Okay. Well, personally, do you think driverless cars are up to speed in the sense that they're able to anticipate all emergencies like children, dogs, cats running in front of your car? Do you think that GPS is ready for prime time?
I think that if GPS by itself, no, will not. I mean, if I were designing a driverless car, I would make sure that GPS was not the only navigation and positioning system used. And by the way, that's the way it is with drones, for example. A drone aircraft all use GPS, but GPS is sort of the bulwark of the system. It's the other navigation systems kind of, run off of GPS in a sense. I mean, they're linked to GPS, but they are also independent systems, and there's no way that the drones can operate sufficiently if all they're using is GPS. But at the same token, there's no way they could operate without GPS.
Okay, now let's talk about what happens when a malevolent entity, such as another country, decides to, well, first of all, field their own GPS system and perhaps even sabotage other people's GPS systems in a war. So, first question, who else is thinking about building a GPS system independent of ours?
Well, At the moment, the only system comparable to GPS in the sense that it's a satellite-based navigation system that has full global coverage and a complete satellite constellation is the GLONASS system run by Russia. And that's a distant second to GPS because it's not nearly as robust or reliable. Aside from that, China's Beidou system and the European Union's Galileo system are up and running, but they're not complete, and it'll be several years before they are. GPS is really far and away out front the ones that everybody uses, and that's why I think this is a point that can't be emphasized too much. It's certainly something I didn't realize when I started researching GPS is that everybody in the world uses GPS, and what I mean by that is it's not just an American system. It's provided free to every single country in the world. And by this, and because of that, everybody uses it. And not only that, but a lot of GPS receivers now will integrate these other systems. I believe the iPhones and iPads, for example, are GLONASS capable. In other words, that they oftentimes your GPS readings will be augmented.
Okay, great. We're going to have to take yet another short commercial break, but after the break, we're going to continue a discussion of the GPS system.
This is Science Fantastic. Here is Professor Michio Kaku.
Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. With us this hour is Greg Milner, author of an exciting new book called Pinpoint: How GPS is Changing Technology, Culture, and Our Minds. And speaking about culture, you have anything to say about the recent Pokemon craze that it seems to have gripped a whole generation of young people addicted to GPS and games?
Yeah, I mean, from what I can tell, more than young people. Yeah, I think it's a particularly fascinating application of GPS in the sense that it's a way for everybody to experience this game that involves real-world locations, and I think it's a fascinating way to just kind of imagine the effect of GPS, that everybody in the world is using it for this thing. I mean, as frivolous as it sounds, I think it's very clever, actually.
Okay, and do you think, therefore, that it could be potentially dangerous with people following GPS into the streets and oblivious of their surroundings?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think, and I've played it a little bit. It's pretty easy to get sucked into, and to the point where you're just walking around looking at your phone rather than anything else. But on the other hand, that's kind of the way I feel like a lot of modern life is lived now anyway, with people walking around staring into their screens instead of keeping track of the world around them.
So you don't think there's any danger about people getting addicted to this or going overboard with this technology?
Well, sure. I think there is. I mean, I think there is with any kind of gaming technology. You can get sucked into it too much. From what I can tell, though, I think it's mostly a benign thing, at least so far. I think the biggest danger, as you say, is people just not paying attention to their physical surroundings, which once again is an ironic result of GPS use, right? That this thing actually can make you less aware of your physical surroundings.
Okay, now let's talk about, well, we briefly touched upon competing technologies, but what happens in case of a war? You know, generals are paid to win wars, they're not paid to lose wars, which means they have to look at all sorts of nefarious options and possibilities. So what does happen in a war? I mean, for example, killer satellites. Several nations have the ability to kill other nations' satellites. That could really do damage to the GPS, right, if all of a sudden our satellites are wiped out. But what are your thoughts about the darker side, that is GPS and war?
Well, my understanding, and I've talked to a lot of people who are paid to worry about this stuff a lot, and even the ones who are worried the most about GPS vulnerabilities are, for the most part, very confident that the GPS satellites are safe, that they don't think there's a problem there. In terms of what could happen in GPS during warfare, I mean, the obvious question is whether the U.S. military would decide to turn it off, at least for reaching certain parts of the world. And I think that is almost very unlikely to happen. I'm not even sure. I'm pretty sure it's not even possible to do that very easily, to shut it off for different parts of the world. But also, so many people in the world depend on it that it would be an act of just extremely gross irresponsibility for the Pentagon to do something like that. And what people should know is that there is a special GPS channel, or GPS signal rather, that only the U.S. military can use and a few other federal government users, and that's pretty safe. I mean, it's even safer from being hacked. and it's something that only those people can use, while the rest of us make do with the civilian signals.
Well, I heard some stories, and, correct me if I'm wrong, that other nations are preparing to launch their own GPS system because in case of a war, the Pentagon may simply surreptitiously modify the coordinates of certain cities, certain military installations without telling anybody, and so the GPS militarily becomes useless. But what are your thoughts? Is that one of the reasons for other nations trying to field their own GPS system?
I think so, and on a sort of larger level, it's just a way to make it seem like you're not dependent on the U.S., right? I mean, GPS can be seen as like, a form of U.S. hegemony, even if you think it's a benign one, so I think a lot of nations want to kind of guard against that. But I don't think that's a realistic fear in terms of the U.S. deciding to. I mean, what the U.S. could conceivably do is they could do what they did for everybody until the year 2000 when President Bill Clinton discontinued this, which was called selective availability. I mean, the GPS civilian signal used to be dithered so that it wasn't very accurate. It was only accurate to within about the length of a football field, and that was because the military was worried about everybody having the same capability that they did. The reason it was shut off, among others, is that it became clear that there were ways around that. Anyone could figure out a way to get around selective availability, and that still holds true. It's even more true today that there be ways to get around that. So I think really that the main upper hand that the U.S. military maintains is that they have this signal that's a little bit more accurate and somewhat more robust. But I don't think that they would ever try to shut off or even interfere with a whole region of the world's GPS signals.
Well, we also have Google Earth, and we have other independent mapping systems, not as good, of course, as GPS, but doesn't that give some kind of assurance that we're not going to, that it'll be very easy to see that someone is tinkering with GPS because we have so many redundant satellites up there in outer space? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think for that reason and a variety of others, if anyone that tried to mess with GPS, people would figure it out pretty quickly, and they'd be able to move to mitigate those threats. So yeah, I think what you say is absolutely true.
And just as an historical footnote, the Russians used to publish maps with the incorrect coordinates of Moscow.
Yep.
Because it was a military secret as to the precise location of Moscow. And the Russians used to publish maps with the incorrect coordinates so that in case of a war, what happened to Napoleon would also happen to, let's say, a Hitler or somebody else.
I mean, they're still trying to figure out, I mean, all the parts of the world still aren't what's called tied together. I mean, there's still different coordinate systems that are being used. And in fact, one of the interesting things about GPS is that it's being used to sort of tie all these things together to make it so that people are all on the same page, literally. I mean, I think as recently as the 60s, the distance between, the United States East Coast and Europe was only known to within like something, I don't know, I think a few miles maybe, or maybe 20 miles or something like that. We never really knew exactly where we were, and we're still figuring that out.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time. So once again, our special guest has been Greg Milner. His book is called Pinpoint, How GPS is Changing Technology, Culture, and Our Minds. So, Greg, once again, thank you so much for being on Science Fantastic.
Thank you.
You're listening to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. Now, Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku.
This is Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. On Science Fantastic, we profile the amazing, jaw-dropping scientific discoveries that are revolutionizing our world and touching our lives. And in this hour, once again, we're going to throw the lines open because this hour is your hour. Well, let's go to the next listener phone call.
I've always wondered if a flame in space, like in a spaceship, will continue to be a flame. And I always wondered if you could wind up a rubber band with a propeller attached to a little airplane, if it would fly in space or inside the space capsule.
Well, believe it or not, you're asking a question that puzzled Albert Einstein back in 1915 when he finally came out with his general theory of relativity, more powerful than his earlier special theory of relativity. And that is, if you're in an elevator and someone snaps the cable, what is it like to be inside that elevator that's falling? Or if you're in a rocket ship, are the laws of physics different if you're traveling at different velocities? Well, this is the principle of relativity, that the laws of physics are the same no matter what velocity you are traveling at. So in other words, you ask us a question, if an astronaut lights a match on the space station, assuming it's safe to do so, then the question is, will the flame be just like normal? And the answer is yes, of course. However, there's weightlessness in outer space, and so the flame is not going to be shaped like a flame. It's going to be spherical, believe it or not. When was the last time you saw a spherical flame? But the laws of physics are the same in an object traveling at uniform velocity. And so flames, light bulbs, yeah, the laws of physics are the same no matter what velocity you are traveling at. Now, you may say to yourself, well, that can't be right, because if I get a flashlight, and if I shine a flashlight on the space station is moving at 18,000 miles per hour. Therefore, the light beam should get a boost. It should be traveling at the speed of light plus 18,000 miles per hour. Nope. The speed of light is always the same no matter where you go. How can that be? If I shine a flashlight forward, backward, left, right, upside down, forward, backwards, it always travels at the same velocity. How can that be? And the reason it is that way is because space and time are distorted so that the speed of light is the same. Now, you may say to yourself, well, that violates common sense. I mean, who could create a universe like that? Well, sorry about that. That's just the way the universe is. Get used to it. Okay, well, let's move right along. Let's take the next listener phone call.
Hi, Michio. This is Michael from Lansing, Michigan. I'm calling about the processing power of the universe, and if there is really such a thing. Maybe I'm thinking about this too much in terms of video games and computers, but I was wondering, how does everything stay generated all the time, everywhere within the universe? Thank you, Michio.
Well, you ask a question that philosophers sometimes ask, and physicists are now asking that question, and that is the universe itself a computer? Is it basically a computer that's doing trillions and trillions of calculations all the time? I mean, for example, if you throw a rock in the air, it obeys Newton's laws of motion, but who tells it? Is there a computer that tells the rock to obey Newton's laws of motion? Because we have simulators that can simulate a rock moving according to Newton's laws of motion, but that's a computer. The computer tells the simulated rock to move according to Newton's laws of motion, and then, of course, you get nice, beautiful parabolas. But the question is, who teaches or who tells the real rock to go in a parabola? At that point, you start to go crazy. You begin to think, well, is the universe itself a simulation? Are we living in an imaginary universe? I mean, look at the movie The Matrix. In the movie The Matrix, everything, like a falling rock, was due to a computer. A computer calculated the motion of a falling rock, and you had the illusion that the rock was falling. Nope. The rock wasn't falling at all. It's just a software program that was designed to create a rock, to simulate a rock moving according to Newton's laws of motion. At that point, you start to go crazy, thinking about, well, how do you tell? How do you tell if the universe is a computer or is a simulation or not? Is it a falsifiable statement? Can you falsify a statement that the universe is a simulation? Now, look at it this way. Take a Hollywood movie on a CD and put it into your computer or your laptop or your TV set. Then all of a sudden on the screen, you see characters acting as if they were acting in the real world. You can imagine actors saying that, no, my universe is not a simulation. The universe is not a computer. I have free will. I can do anything I want because I am the master of my fate. But, of course, you're listening to a movie in which the characters claim they have free will, they're acting of their own volition, that the universe is not a simulation. And so then the question is, how do you tell if everything is a simulation or not? Actually, I'm not quite sure. We physicists are debating this question even as we speak. There is something called a quantum computer. A quantum computer computes on individual atoms. One day it will replace silicon computers. That's why the CIA is very much interested in quantum computers. But then the question is the universe a quantum computer? Because the universe computes on atoms, because, of course, everything is made out of atoms. Well, like I said, at that point, you start to go crazy thinking about, well, the movie The Matrix, was it really correct? We physicists are actually divided on this question. Okay, let's move right along to the next listener phone call.
Yes, my name is James Blaisdell. I would like to ask about cryogenics, if they're far enough advanced to be used for distance travel. Thank you.
Well, I think what you're getting at is cryonics, which is different from cryogenics. Cryogenics is the legitimate study of objects that are cooled down to very low temperatures. Cryonics is a rather dubious form of technology where you're frozen, and if you have a fatal disease and you're going to die of that disease, hopefully you can perhaps be revived at some point in the future, and at that point we will have cured cancer and many other fatal diseases, and then you can live forever. In fact, you can actually do this on the web. If you look up cryonics, yes, they are commercial companies which say that they'll freeze your body in liquid nitrogen so that you could be traveling to a distant star at some point in the future, or just sitting in a laboratory waiting centuries into the future when there's a cure for many of these fatal diseases. Well, let me be very clear about this. In the history of science, we have not a single incidence of one man who's been frozen solid and then revived to tell about it. I repeat, there's not a single incidence of a person who's been frozen solid and then lived to tell about it after he's been revived. Now, you may say to yourself, what about animals? I mean, if you live near a farm, you know that when the lake freezes over, sometimes frogs and fish are frozen in the ice, and then when springtime comes along, the frog jumps out and the fish swim as if nothing had happened. Well, there's a secret behind this. It turns out that glucose, that is a form of sugar, is an antifreeze. Just like the antifreeze you put in your car in wintertime, it lowers the freezing point of water so that your car can still function even when it's ice cold outside. In the same way, the bodily fluids of these animals are still liquid, even if they're frozen solid in a block of ice. Now, why can't you do that for interstellar space travel? Or why can't you do that to live forever? Well, there's a problem. The amount of antifreeze necessary to do this in your body will kill you. In fact, some people say, well, why can't we use other antifreezes? Well, they've been tried on animals. It turns out that the results are usually fatal. The results are that large animals simply cannot be frozen using some of the antifreezes that you find in a chemical laboratory. Now, let me be very, very clear about this. That doesn't mean that at some point in the future, somebody may figure out how to do it. That's always possible. So maybe, yes, maybe somebody who's frozen solid might be able to be thawed out at some point in the future. But at the present time, we don't know how to do it. At the present time, it's an untested technology. And at the present time, nobody has ever been thought out this way.
Everyone's favorite physics professor. You're listening to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. Here's Professor Michio Kaku.
Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. On Science Fantastic, we take your phone calls. Okay, moving right along, let's take the next listener phone call.
I was wondering what the frequency of the gravitational wave recently discovered with the gravitation detector equipment. And this is Constance from Warren, Michigan. Thank you.
Okay, well, yes, a few months ago it hit the headlines, not just once but twice. Scientists have actually detected vibrations from colliding black holes in outer space. Let me begin by breaking it down. Back in 1915, Einstein proposed a theory of gravity that said that gravity is actually due to the fact that space-time is like a fabric that can stretch. And if you are then moving along the fabric, then your path is bent sideways or whatever, just like what gravity does. And just like the surface of a pond now, if you were to throw a rock into a pond, you get ripples forming on the surface of the pond. And then Einstein said, well, gravity must be like that. If I have a tremendous disturbance, then shock waves should emanate from the impact, and we should be able to absorb that with our instruments. However, he did a quick calculation, and he quickly realized that in his lifetime, he would not be able to detect these gravity waves. So this went on for 100 years, from 1916 to 2016. For 100 years, scientists have tried to look for gravity waves. And they did it by building a gigantic machine called LIGO, two of them, one in Washington State and one in Louisiana. It's basically two laser beams that form a joint. It looks like an L. When these two laser beams collide, they form an interference pattern, just like the interference pattern you get on the surface of your bathtub if you make waves on the surface of your bathtub. Well, if there's a colliding black hole in outer space, it creates waves. These waves then hit the laser beam, jiggle the laser beams, and then our instruments are sensitive enough to be able to detect the fact that they've picked up the vibrations. Then you can take these vibrations, run it through an audio amplifier to get sound waves coming out of it. Now, the media call this the music of the spheres. That is music from black holes. Actually, it's not anything of the sort. But, if you stretch your imagination a bit, what we're talking about is gravity waves from space-time itself jiggling a diaphragm, and the diaphragm then jiggles air waves, giving you sound. And if you go to nasa.gov, you can actually find the link where you can listen to it. You can actually listen to some of the vibrations. Now, the frequency of these vibrations is pretty low because you're talking about sound frequencies, and it really has not much to do with the real physics of what is happening. The real physics of what is happening is when I have what is called a spin 2 wave coming at you that can then be broken down using electromagnetic sensors and laser beams. But it's kind of cute. It's kind of cute, the fact that you can then take this electromagnetic wave, run it through a sound amplifier, and hear it. But you're not really hearing the black hole, as the media said.
You're listening to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. Listening to Science Fantastic.
Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. Yes, this hour is your hour. This is the time when you can get to the telephones and give us a call and have your thoughts heard on over 100 radio stations that carry Science Fantastic. Okay, well, let's now take the next listener phone call.
Hey, Dr. Kaku. My name is Wade Anderson. I'm calling from Rainsville, Alabama. And I was just wondering is it not possible that darkness is faster than light? Because I've seen programs that show black holes in space that light cannot escape. Thank you.
Well, the short answer is no. It turns out that darkness is nothing but the absence of light. And therefore, light travels at the speed of light, obviously. So the absence of light that is a shadow would also emanate and move at the speed of light. Now, black holes, as you pointed out, light cannot escape from a black hole. Light simply orbits around a black hole. But if you are in the frame, that is, if you're in a rocket ship traveling along the light beam, it would also travel at the speed of light. And so any way you cut it, you cannot break the light barrier this way. Darkness does not travel faster than the speed of light. Darkness is nothing but light itself. But here's a question that I asked myself when I was a kid. If you get a flashlight and zip it across the heavens, from one side of the heavens, one horizon, to the other horizon, and you were to go far enough out there and out of space, didn't that light beam go faster than the speed of light? Because you went from one side of the universe to the other side of the universe at a velocity much faster than the speed of light. And the answer to that is actually yes. However, you cannot send net information this way. Yes, it's true that if you get a flashlight and zip it across the night sky, then the image will actually travel faster than the speed of light. But you cannot send usable information that way. Here's another example. Let's take a pair of scissors and close the scissors and then calculate the speed at which the joints of the two blades converge. If you go far enough into outer space, assuming these scissors are huge and very lengthy, then at a certain point, the joining point joins faster than the speed of light because, of course, the scissors are millions of miles long and you close them very rapidly. If the blades are long enough, then the joint will also close faster than the speed of light. But again, it's useless information. You cannot send Morse code this way. You cannot send usable information. So can some things travel faster than light? The answer is yes. Images. Images will go faster than light, like zipping a flashlight across the night sky. But it's fake in the sense you cannot send Morse code this way. You cannot send usable information to the nearby stars faster than light.
You're listening to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. Science Fantastic.
Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. Once again, give us a call because the lines are open. Let's take the next listener phone call.
Hey, it's 8:20 a.m. in Tampa, Florida. The theory of relativity was first published by the Frenchman Henri Poincaré before Einstein later plagiarized it. Then this general theory of relativity is not a general theory of relativity at all. It's just a theory of gravity. Einstein had no business calling it a general theory of relativity, and it was first published by David Hilbert, the German David Hilbert. So why is his name in any of the physics books? He didn't do any of these things if you look closely at it. Thank you.
Well, you ask a very interesting question, and I once wrote a biography of Albert Einstein called Einstein's Cosmos, where I actually went through each and every one of the claims that you mentioned. Well, first of all, as most historians know, and as Einstein himself said on a number of occasions, that when he wrote down the theory of relativity in 1905, well, yeah, there were other people that were very close to getting it, but they didn't have the full Lorentz transformation, and they misinterpreted the data all incorrectly. First of all, if you shoot a light beam in the forward direction and sideways, you would expect the velocity of light to change depending upon the direction of the light beam. If I have a flashlight and I shine it forward, backward, up, down, left, and right, you would expect the speed of light to be different depending upon the direction that you sent it. But no, it comes out the same every single time. And so, since the Earth moves in space, people said that the Earth must be moving in an ether wind, and the ether wind makes the yardstick contract. And therefore, there were all these papers trying to create a mechanical contraction of meter sticks in order to get the Michelson-Morley experiments to come out right. Well, here comes Einstein and says, no, 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 you got it all wrong. It's space itself. It's space that is contracting. That means that everything in space, not just meter sticks, but people, brains, bodies, everything contracts along that same direction. So in other words, he was proposing a general principle for all of reality, not simply an electromechanical effect to explain the fact that meter sticks were coming out wrong. Now, yeah, Poincaré was very close. Other people were close. Lawrence, Fitzgerald, yeah, they were close. And Henri Poincaré, the great mathematician, was also very close. But, again, they missed it. They didn't realize that these effects were effects that affected the speed of time and space itself. They all missed it. Einstein was saying that even clocks, everything, not just meter sticks that you measure in the Michelson-Morley experiment, but reality itself was slowing down. That was mind-boggling, and only Einstein got it right. Second of all, Einstein then came out with the theory of gravity. It's called general theory because it's more general than a theory of light. It's a theory of gravity. Because back then they didn't know about the nuclear force. Well, let's take a short commercial break, and then I'll talk about whether or not Einstein was beat by a German mathematician by the name of David Hilbert.
Don't feel bad. I didn't understand theoretical n-dimensional metaphysics the first time either. But if you call and ask, Professor Kaku will get you there. You're listening to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. You're listening to Science Fantastic.
Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. The lines are open. Well, where we last left off, a listener called in and said, wait a minute, maybe Einstein has to share the credit, or maybe he even stole some ideas from David Hilbert, a famous German mathematician who published some of these ideas. Well, I looked into the history of that charge. It turns out that from 1905 to 1915, Einstein was struggling for a general theory of relativity, a theory not just of light, but of gravity as well. Because back then, that's all they knew about. They didn't know about any nuclear force. They thought that that was it, light and gravity. That's what made the universe tick. Well, David Hilbert, being a mathematician, comes out with a list of unsolved questions in mathematics. He challenged the world of mathematics to solve these unsolved problems. And of course, the world's greatest minds tried to solve these problems. One of the problems that David Hilbert wrote about was to mathematically put down all the laws of nature, all of them, all the laws of physics into a single framework. Well, he heard that Einstein was working on this. And so he invited Albert Einstein to give 3 long lectures at his university about his unfinished general theory of relativity. So then Einstein elaborately laid out this enormous mathematical structure using tensor calculus, the Ricci tensor, using the most advanced forms of mathematics known at that time as an attempt to create the unified field theory. Well, Hilbert, being a mathematician, realized that there was one thing missing in this elaborate mathematical framework, and that is a series of identities called the Bianchi identities. And Hilbert, being a mathematician, said, well, look, you, Einstein, have laid out this tremendous apparatus, this huge mathematical foundation, but you miss one last step, and that is the Bianchi identities. Well, Hilbert, being a mathematician, completed it and published it without giving Einstein credit. Wow, this was scandalous. Absolutely scandalous. Here was Einstein, who had given a series of talks. Many people had heard his talks, laying out the mathematical foundation of general relativity. And he, in turn, also later got the Bianchi identities, and he finished it. So he published his theory in November of 1915, shortly after David Hilbert also published his theory, which, of course, was the same theory, because he copied it from Albert Einstein. Well, Einstein was PO'd, to say the least. He even wrote a letter to Hilbert a few months later saying that at first I was irritated, but now I've gotten over it. So in other words, Hilbert was a great mathematician. He did complete the last mathematical step leading to what is called today the Einstein-Hilbert equation. And so in honor of both individuals, we call it the Einstein-Hilbert action. All textbooks will say that. But everybody knows who really got it first. Everybody knows who wrote the foundation, who wrote the mathematics, who wrote the entire framework, but he just missed the last step, which was the Bianchi identities. And in fact, it's now a stain on Hilbert's reputation that he actually tried to steal an idea from Albert Einstein in order to complete one of his unfinished problems in mathematics. But like I said, we physicists, we have completed the dots. In fact, we even now have the notebooks of Albert Einstein going year by year. In fact, in 1912, 3 years before, he actually got the correct equation, but he made a mistake, a mathematical mistake, and crossed out that equation. But he actually had the general theory actually back in 1912, 3 years before David Hilbert. And so the lesson is, yes, we're all human. Even the greatest mathematician of his time, David Hilbert, could try to swipe a theory from the greatest physicist of his time, Albert Einstein. Okay, well, let's move right along to the next listener phone call.
Hi, my name's Eugene Pate, and I just listened to your radio show about Stephen Hawking's idea of sending a postage-sized spacecraft to another planet. Well, the whole idea of building the lasers and stuff seems sort of prohibitive. What's wrong with the idea of building a small miniature rocket ship with a small amount of rocket fuel that you could take aboard the space shuttle, much like a model rocket with the same postage-sized technology on it, and since you've got something already in space and doesn't have to escape the atmosphere, you can shoot this towards another planet and have a little fuel left for guidance along the way. But once you put an object in motion in space and attain a certain speed, there's nothing to slow it down. So you could just take a rocket up on the space shuttle with your postage stamp technology and launch it in space.
Okay, well, I have 10 seconds to answer that question, and that is, your idea is ingenious, but it's not going to work because you need 800 megawatts. That's the power of 800 nuclear power plants, and you can't put that on the International Space Station. It's simply prohibitively expensive.
Now, Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku.
This is Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. On Science Fantastic, we profile the amazing, jaw-dropping scientific discoveries which are revolutionizing our world and touching our lives. And once again, in this hour, we're going to throw the lines open because this hour is your hour. Okay, well, moving right along, let's move on to the first listener phone call.
Hi, Professor Kaku. I was just wondering, I was recently reading a book by David Eagleman where he spoke about how people can replace one sense, like the sense of hearing, with another, like the sense of touch. And so I was just wondering if you had any ideas or interesting things to talk about how there might be some other things that our brain is just not equipped to perceive out there. Thank you very much.
Well, in fact, I had Dr. Eagleman on Science Fantastic asking him about the very things that you mentioned. There's something called synesthesia. And synesthesia is basically people who get their senses confused. So instead of hearing something, they see light. Now, I actually had somebody with synesthesia on radio, and he suffered from Asperger's syndrome, and he had an incredible memory. He memorized pi. Pi, the number, he memorized pi to about 10,000 decimal places. He holds the world's record for memorizing pi. And in fact, he had to have a team of people checking him as he rattled off all the indices of pi. It took him several hours to recite all the digits. So I asked him, how is it possible, Mr. Tennant, that you can memorize pi to 10,000 decimal places? And he says, well, he associates a color with each of the 10,000 digits. You see, he also suffers from synesthesia. When he hears a number in his mind, he sees a color, because the wiring of his brain, there's a mismatch. And then I asked him, well, how do you memorize 10,000 colors? And he said, well, I really don't know. It just comes to me, and that's how he memorized pi to 10,000 decimal places. Now, what this means is that your brain also has that same capability. There's several theories that I mentioned in my book about how it's possible the brain can do this, but genetically, we're not all that dissimilar. Therefore, if this guy can do it, has a photographic memory, then it's possible that you too might have a photographic memory, but it's been turned off. So when you interview these people with photographic memory, they sometimes say that they wish they didn't have it, because all these totally extraneous, unimportant facts come hitting at them, totally useless. One woman, for example, is a housewife in Los Angeles. She has a photographic memory. If you ask her, what were you doing at 2 o'clock in the afternoon 10 years ago to the very day, she'll tell you what she was doing 10 years ago at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And she says it's like having split memory. It's like one part of your brain reliving a day 10 years ago, and the other part of your brain seeing everything that you are seeing now. Totally useless, she said. So in other words, maybe nature mercifully gave us the ability to forget. Now, one theory that explains this is that we used to think that forgetting occurred naturally, that with time, memories degrade. There's a new theory out there which kind of shocked me when I heard it. And that theory is that your brain records memories, and then your brain has to deliberately erase memories as well. Erasing is just as complicated as remembering. Erasing doesn't occur naturally at all. Now, if that's true, then these people have a broken erase mechanism. Their brain has forgotten how to erase. Their brain just memorizes everything in sight. If this theory is true, this means that you too may have this ability to remember everything that your senses record. But in these individuals, in fact, in most people, it's been turned off. However, in these people, it's broken, and therefore they memorize everything. Okay, well, let's move right on. And in fact, if you want to know more about this, get a copy of my book, The Future of the Mind. I have a whole chapter on things like this.
This is Science Fantastic. Here is Professor Michio Kaku.
Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. On Science Fantastic, we're throwing the lines open in this hour, and you can get on Science Fantastic. So let's take the next listener phone call.
Yes, sir. I was listening to your show. I'm kind of a first-time listener, and it's fascinating. I love science. My question would be, how does a creator, intelligent design, or the beginning of the world, or God, if you will, fit in to science, and how you feel about that?
Well, that's a big question, so let me try to break it down. First of all, Galileo himself, the founder of modern science, was asked that question, and he answered it as follows. He says the purpose of the church is to determine how to get to heaven, and the purpose of science is to determine how the heavens go. So in other words, they're different. The purpose of the church is to determine how to go to heaven. In other words, ethics, behavior, how to act like a good person. That's what the church is all about. And science is about how the heavens go. That is, it's about natural law. It's about the laws of the universe. Now, the problem occurs when scientists begin to pontificate about ethics, or when religious people begin to pontificate about natural law. That's where the problem occurs. Because as long as you keep the two distinct, realize that science does not tell you what is a good thing or a bad thing. That's what society tells you. Where do you draw the line between a felony and a misdemeanor? What is good? What is bad? These are things that society has to democratically decide upon. However, in science, we talk about things that occur in natural law throughout the universe. What does a felony or a misdemeanor mean on another star system? So you begin to see that they're two different domains, so they're not necessarily in opposition to each other at all. Now, then Einstein was asked the question, do you believe in God? And he says, well, let's break it down. There are two kinds of God. First, there's the personal God, the God that you pray to, the God that parts the waters. And he said that he did not necessarily believe in a personal God because we're talking about the creator of the universe. Does the creator of the universe really care about killing the Philistines or whether or not you pray to get a bicycle for Christmas? I think perhaps God has more important things to think about. And then Einstein said he believed in the God of Spinoza. That is the God of reason, harmony, the God of order, beauty, simplicity. Because you see, the universe didn't have to be this way. The universe could have been random. It could have been chaotic. It could have been a jumble of random things. But here we are, living in a gorgeous universe with natural laws that could be figured out by human beings. And he thought that, well, that's the God that he believed in. Okay, well, moving right along, let's take the next listener phone call.
Yes, my name is Lou Cooley. I'm calling because I have a question that perplexes me. How can the universe be in nothing? The universe has to be in something, in my thought, and that has to be in something. It's like it's stranger than fiction. It's so big you can't realize it, and the universe is so small you can't realize it. Can you explain that idea that I'm talking about? Thank you.
Well, you asked one of the deepest questions, a question that theologians have asked. For example, some theologians thought that the oceans, no matter how far they seem to be, are sitting upon a turtle. And the whole universe is basically a disk sitting upon a cosmic turtle. Then the question is, well, what is the turtle sitting on? Well, the turtle is sitting upon another turtle. And how many turtles are there? Well, there's an infinite number of turtles going all the way down. And then the question is, well, what supports an infinite number of turtles? St. Thomas Aquinas was asked this question, and he was asked the question, is there a first mover? Well, why do objects move? Objects move because they're pushed by something. But what pushes that? Well, something else had to push that. But then what pushed that? Well, something else had to push that. And then St. Thomas Aquinas asked himself the question, well, if there's an infinite number of pushers, what is pushing that? And so you go crazy trying to think about this. Is there an infinite number of layers of existence? Well, science simply says the following. Well, first of all, science itself evolves. Back in the 1920s, for example, astronomers thought that the universe was the Milky Way galaxy. That's it. Period. End of story. If you ask an astronomer back in the 1920s, how big is the universe anyway? They would say, oh, that's easy. The universe is roughly 100,000 light years across. That's the size of the Milky Way from one edge to the other. That's the universe. But then Edwin Hubble comes along and finds out there are other universes out there. Billions of other universes. And so we're back to the turtle question. How many turtles are there? Now, the short answer is we don't really know at the present time. The Hubble Space Telescope can see 100 billion galaxies out there, each galaxy containing 100 billion stars. And so how many stars are out there? Well, the number of stars we can see with a telescope is 100 billion times 100 billion. That's an incredibly large number, but you can actually quantify it in terms of how big the universe, the visible universe, is. And then the question is, what's beyond the visible universe? And again, the short answer is we don't know. However, let me give you two theories. One theory is that the universe perhaps is just infinite. It just goes on forever, endlessly. That is a solution of Einstein's equation. Another solution of Einstein's equation says that the universe is a ball of some sort. It's a four-dimensional ball. And it's a bubble. And what is the bubble doing? It's floating in a larger ocean. An ocean of turtles? No, it's an ocean of hyperspace, 11-dimensional hyperspace. And so one theory, coming from string theory, says that our universe is a bubble. We live on the skin of the bubble. The bubble is expanding. There are other bubbles out there, and the arena that the universe exists in, that floats in, is 11-dimensional hyperspace, dimensions beyond comprehension. And it's impossible to explain all of string theory in just a few minutes. Get a copy of some of my books, Hyperspace, Parallel Worlds. I have a whole discussion about string theory and what is 11-dimensional hyperspace. Okay, well, moving right along, let's take the next listener phone call.
Hello, Doctor. I'm calling from Clearwater, Florida. Just thinking about black holes. Is it possible that the black holes are the garbage cans of the universe? Thank you.
Well, you're exactly right. Some people think that black holes are the ultimate Roche motel. Everything checks in, but nothing checks out. So that is a plausible theory. However, it's not satisfying because when a star disappears into a black hole, and we see this happening now with our telescopes and sensors, you kind of wonder, well, what happened to the star? Is it just eaten up? Is there a garbage can there? And is there another side to the garbage can? Well, the short answer is we don't know, because even though Einstein's theory predicts the existence of black holes, even though we see these black holes in outer space, we have to use a higher set of equations, because Einstein's equations break down at the center of a black hole. They're useless. Einstein's equations simply say that the gravity at the center of a black hole is infinite. Now, what does that mean? That doesn't help you at all. We physicists don't believe in infinite energy. What it really means is that Einstein's theory has simply broken down. And again, that's where string theory comes in, because string theory goes right through the center of a black hole. Now, is there another universe on the other side of a black hole? That's one theory. Watch the movie Interstellar, starring Matthew McConaughey. And the people consulting for that movie were Caltech physicists, colleagues of mine. And they use the latest in terms of computer projections and computer simulations to simulate exactly what happens when you go through the event horizon of a black hole and head toward the center of a black hole. Now, of course, this is Hollywood. And what do they find at the center of a black hole? A gateway to another universe. That is a solution of Einstein's equations. And again, do we have the technology to go through the black hole? And the answer is no. So how did they get away with it in the movie? Okay, well, how did they get away with it in the movie? I'll answer that question after the commercial break.
You're listening to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. Here's Professor Michio Kaku.
Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. On Science Fantastic, we explore the cutting edge of science, the very edge of what is known about this great universe of ours. Let me then answer the question that was raised previously, and that is, what lies on the other side of a black hole? The short answer is we don't know. Einstein's equations break down at that point. String theory, however, does go through the black hole. One possible solution, I'm not saying it's the only one, one possible solution is that there's a gateway, a wormhole, a dimensional portal connecting that universe to another universe. And then how do you get the energy necessary to drill a hole in space and time? In the movie, they get around that. In the movie, it turns out that our descendants, our future people of the future do have the technology to create a wormhole to go back into the past and meet us. That's how they get around that very clever trick. How do you create a wormhole through time? And the answer is you have to wait for your descendants to create a wormhole so they can visit you in the past. A very clever way that Hollywood has of getting around that problem. Moving right along, let's take the next listener phone call.
Yes, Professor. This is Bob in Chicago. If you were traveling at the speed of light in a ship or even on a carpet, a magic carpet, would your mass be infinite once you reach the speed of light?
Well, you ask a very interesting question, because if you read Einstein's original paper of 1905, he says that as you approach the speed of light, all sorts of bizarre, strange things begin to happen. First of all, time slows down. That freaks people out. But hey, we measure this every day with our satellites now. Einstein was right. The faster you move, the slower time beats. And that's why your GPS system works. That's why your cell phone works, for God's sake. If it wasn't for Einstein, your cell phones wouldn't work. And you get heavier. In fact, if you hit the speed of light, you have infinite mass. So how do you get around that? Well, you get around that very simply. You cannot reach the speed of light. Now, if you could reach the speed of light, which is not possible, your mass would be infinite. And, of course, that's silly. Who ever heard of infinite mass? And so it simply means that Einstein's equations have been verified at sublight velocities. And at the speed of light, you have, of course, light beams. And light beams obey a different set of equations. Light beams have zero rest mass. Therefore, they do not have infinite mass at all. Some people ask that question. Well, if light travels at the speed of light, and if your mass is infinite at the speed of light, then how come light does not have infinite mass? And the answer is very simple. Light has zero rest mass, and therefore it cannot have infinite mass at all. And so when Einstein came out with this theory, of course, he was hit from all sides. A lot of people didn't believe him. In fact, even Adolf Hitler commissioned teams of scientists to try to tear down Einstein's theory. And of course, they all failed, because Einstein's theory has been experimentally verified. And the simplest verification of Einstein's theory is your cell phone.
You're listening to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. Listening to Science Fantastic.
Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. Give us a call. The lines are open. Well, let's take the next listener phone call.
Thank you, Professor, for taking my call. This is Charlie, 102.3 WGOW, Chattanooga, Tennessee. And my question is about the moon. We all know what the moon does for our planet. All right. At one point, you said that, or they said, that something hit the Earth and knocked off a chunk, and that became our moon. All right. Which came first, the moon or the water, the ocean or the moon? Thank you very much.
Well, you ask a very interesting question, and that is, well, if the moon was blown out of the Earth, which seems likely, then which came first, the oceans or the moon? Well, we're not sure about this because, of course, no one was there to photograph what was happening. But we think that the moon was blown out of the Earth roughly 4.1 billion years ago. Now, the Earth itself is 4.5 billion years old. That's the age of the sun, by the way. The sun, the planets, all condensed out of the same cloud roughly 4.5 billion years ago. We know this by dating meteorites, some of the oldest objects in the solar system, and we also know the age of the sun. The sun is a gigantic hydrogen bomb. We know almost everything about hydrogen bombs because the Pentagon has been funding generously physicists for decades. And we can actually gauge the age of the sun because we know the rate at which the sunshine falls on the planet Earth. So as a consequence, we're able to know that the Earth is roughly 4.5 billion years. And then the astronauts brought back moon rock. And looking at the moon rocks, we realize that the rock of the moon is very similar, almost identical to the rock found here on the planet Earth. And by looking at Newton's laws of motion, we can actually run the videotape backwards and rule out or rule in different scenarios of how the moon was created. All these theories coalesce into one theory, showing that the moon was probably blown out roughly 4.1 billion years ago, plus or minus, of course. Now, the oceans, we're not quite sure where the oceans came from. One theory is that comets and asteroids brought most of the water to the planet Earth. But as you can imagine, even if the Earth had a primitive ocean, a very primitive ocean 4.1 billion years ago, and an asteroid the size of Mars were to hit the Earth and blow the moon into space, whatever ocean we had would vaporize. And so the answer to your question is perhaps the moon was born first and the oceans came later. But again, we think it was a process. We think it took millions of years for the oceans to form, and we're still learning more about the solar system.
Yes, Professor Kaku can help you with your homework. He can even help you with your kids' homework, but only if you ask. You're listening to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. You're listening to Science Fantastic.
Welcome back to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku. Once again, the lines are open. Let's take now the next listener phone call.
Professor, this is Julia. I'm in Chattanooga, Tennessee, listening to WGOW Radio 102.3. My question, cell phones. Say, for instance, the astronauts at the space station. Can they take a cell phone with them and call home? Just wondering. Thank you very much for your time. Have a wonderful day.
Well, you ask an interesting question, because at first you may say to yourself, no, come on. I mean, they're in outer space. They're 300 miles above the surface of the Earth, traveling at 18,000 miles per hour. How can they possibly take a phone call? But then you ask yourself another question. Well, exactly where does your cell phone connect to? Cell phones are ubiquitous. You can go pretty much anywhere where we have civilization, and you can take out your cell phone. So exactly what happens to your cell phone when you make a phone call? Well, first of all, chances are there's a microwave tower outside someplace, a microwave tower that then receives and sends signals from perhaps millions of cell phones in a metropolitan area. So when you're outside, you can link to a microwave tower. Second, there's Wi-Fi. You could be in a restaurant, for example, and there's a small little Wi-Fi unit, perhaps no more than a box that's like 6 inches wide, and has an antenna. And it picks up and sends messages to your cell phone, and that little box in turn is connected to a server someplace. Now, in outer space, there are not going to be any microwave towers. Therefore, that's not going to be how you're going to communicate. But there could be Wi-Fi there. In other words, there could be a little box with an antenna that simply picks up your cell phone message and then beams it down to the planet Earth, because it's in radio communication with mission control. And so your cell phone call may be rerouted through mission control. Now, is it already set up this way? That I don't know. You'll have to talk to an astronaut or talk to NASA about that. But it wouldn't take that much. It wouldn't take that much, really, to connect a cell phone on the space shuttle to a Wi-Fi unit, which then communicates to the planet Earth. Okay, well, moving right along now, let's take the next listener phone call.
Professor Kaku, this is William, Radio 970, Portland, Oregon. My question is there a homosexual gene that a person can inherit even though there is no history of homosexuality? Thank you very much.
Well, you ask a very controversial question, and there's only a limited amount of reproducible testable, falsifiable data on this question. In fact, I interviewed one of the leading biologists who has tried to find the so-called gay gene. In fact, he announced several years ago that he thought he was hot on the trail of a gay gene, but since then, other researchers have not been able to reproduce his results. Now, we know there is some genetic component to it, but it's not 100%. In other words, there's not just one gay gene. It turns out if you look at identical twins, you can have one twin who is gay and the other one who is not. If it was simply a single gene that determined whether or not you were gay, then of course you wouldn't have that. However, you can look at the genetics and you see that, well, there could be a genetic link. That is, if you are gay, then yeah, there's a slight elevated chance that perhaps your siblings are also gay as well. And so, to summarize, there's no proof one way or the other as to whether or not there is a gay gene. They're just theories. One theory, for example, says that perhaps in the fetus, perhaps the fetus is bathed with hormones which then determine whether or not the brain is going to be male or female. You see, we are born female. We're all born female, but then we have hormones hitting us in the womb, which then determine whether or not we are male or female. So you can be genetically male, but your brain tells you otherwise, depending upon the amount of hormones that you get in the fetus. But again, let me stress again, these are just theories. We have no definitive proof one way or the other, even though people have tried to look for a gay gene. And in fact, I even had one of the leading individuals, Professor Hammer, who claimed to have found a gay gene. So at the present time, it's up in the air. Well, I'm afraid that's it for Science Fantastic. We've run out of time.
Go ahead. Try to stop him. But be warned, Professor Kaku is really smart. Like, whoa, this guy is smart. You're listening to Science Fantastic with Professor Michio Kaku.